environmentalism, it's nuclear warfare, and so forth. In fact, the third book that was published is called Sanctifying Misandry, and what we did in that book was look at the new myth that has been created in the name of history, which is really just a reverse of the biblical story of in the beginning, there was God, and then Eve caused this problem of sin, and then everything deteriorated after that. Now it's in the beginning is the great goddess. Well, what happens when you look at historical and anthropological accounts of societies? Did every society have a goddess? Well, no. Some had gods, some had both gods and goddesses, some had goddesses. So it takes an enormous amount of work to unpack this thing that men have all the power and patriarchy is the primary evil, and the essentialism that goes along with that.
And it is true, patriarchy, of course, it's a simple answer. It's an answer to everything. It's the scientific equivalent of a witch did it. You can explain anything with it. Anything that you see is, of course, the fault of patriarchy. But moving back to the definition, you pretty much dismiss power as the key factor in sexism. Looking at that definition, is it just prejudice then? Is that all that's left, or is it something else?
Well, I would say that the defining feature of sexism in either form is hatred. It's about hatred. Now, we can all argue, what are the effects of hatred? Hatred might amount to nothing more than a joke. It could involve anything from that to murder. But the defining feature of sexism has got to be hatred. And I want to distinguish between hatred and anger. People have often said, oh, well, yes, women are angry about this and angry about that. Men are angry. Everybody's angry. But that is, anger is an emotion. And therefore it's transient. We define hatred as a collective, culturally constructed worldview, and which people deliberately propagate. And so in that sense, we want to define sexism, including misandry, as motivated and sustained by hatred, which is culturally propagated.
I think I want to add a footnote here, too. I mean, sometimes there are situations and historical moments when men had power. Okay? I mean, misogyny existed in times and places. So, again, we can't create definitions that forget about the complexity of history on both sides of this gender question. I think the bottom line here is that history is extremely complicated. The topic of gender is extremely complicated. The vicissitudes and changes are very complicated, and we always have to be very attentive to the details of time and place, but also some of the problems that transcend time and place.
Throughout here so far, you've very much addressed misandry and misogyny as being two sides of the same coin. Obviously, you're assuming that they coexist, yes?
Yes. They do, yes.
Well, that's a simple question, simple answer.
Well, I think they do, especially now. I think there's some times in history where, I mean, I found examples in past societies where I did see misandry, very ancient societies, and male vulnerability and angst. So misandry was there in some times in the past, but I suspect it's more present now than it was in past societies. Misogyny was very common in the past. And today, it's still around, but it's often under control, or as soon as there's a misogynist episode, immediately there's a critique, there's public statements, the media is onto it. And I think we're going to get to that point with misandry too.
Yes, I'd like to sort of underline that. We have agencies, government agencies, private agencies monitoring misogyny, so that whenever there is an example, whether it's some parliamentarian or some senator in the States or some stupid thing, there's an immediate kerfuffle, and the journalists are all over it, and they had it on the talk show. Misandry is not so well documented or monitored. I mean, it's beginning. There certainly are websites that are taking that seriously. But we have a long way to go before there's a sense in society at large that both of these problems need to be monitored. They're part of the same problem. And getting back to hatred, I just think that hatred is not something that can be easily contained. It somehow mutates and it spreads and it legitimates other forms of hatred. And so if you have a society that says, well, it's okay to hate these people but not these people, that's a recipe for disaster. Who's to say which hatred is good and which hatred is bad?
Since you're focusing on misandry, can you talk to us about some examples of how you see misandry affecting men today?
Well, one example is the recent renewal of the Violence Against Women Act in the States. Now, the title itself is very interesting, Violence Against Women. Of course, there is violence against women, and it is a bad thing, and it needs an act to enforce people measures against that. But it assumes that there is no such thing as violence against men, or if there is, that it's an epic phenomenon. It's not important, it's trivial. Now that is what I would call a sexist assumption. And people often say, well, yes, there's violence against men, but then most of the perps are men. And that is sort of like blaming the victims. I mean, because it doesn't matter who murders somebody. The murder victim is a victim and should be honored and respected, and not treated as if, oh well, he's a man, so he had it coming, or he deserved it somehow. So now the Violence Against Women Act has been modified recently, and most of the language in the text is gender neutral. They do say that this is an act that is trying to discourage violence against men and women and gay people or minority people. And that's good. That is an advance, and it's something that we can work with. I'm a little bit anxious about it because very often gender-neutral legislation tends to get interpreted in ways that are not gender-neutral. Okay, so we have all these rules and legislation around things like custody and divorce, and and every jurisdiction, there are 1,000 jurisdictions, and they all have slightly different regulations. But nevertheless, there is still a problem because a lot of people find that they are being denied access to their children, that they have no access to the court, that the family court system itself is biased against men. So even though the legislation itself is in gender-neutral terms.
Now, when this legislation was passed, I thought the statements of two men who helped to get this renewed Violence Against Women Act through with some changed language was very interesting. There's Pat Leahy, a Democrat, who said we cannot pick and choose which victims to protect. A victim is a victim is a victim. Violence is violence is violence. And then the Attorney General, Eric Holder, said, I applaud Congress for passing a bipartisan reauthorization that protects everyone, women and men, gay and straight, children and adults of all races, ethnicities, countries of origin, and tribal affiliation. So at least the gender inclusive language is in. That's a big step. And now people will start to monitor whether it's actually being used. And there will be processes of complaint. This act is open to support groups, counseling, and so forth for any victim of violence. And if there are people who are not getting the services, then there's groups for complaint. So I think it's more pessimistic. I'm optimistic that this is a big step. There need to be many, many steps like this, but when you start to see that opening, how hard it is to even get a bit of opening into the